So for today's class, we're going to review the passage of blood through the heart, and we're going to trace that with your fingers. And then we're going to talk about how the heart is controlled both by itself as well as by the brain, because it's done intrinsically is the word. That's like intrinsically or internally, as well as externally or extrinsically by the brain. So what people don't know is that even if your brain isn't properly functioning, your heart can actually beat on its own. And it's a pretty amazing thing. It's the only muscle in the body that can do that. So we'll get started with a diagram that we had last class. So this one. Now, what I want you to do is take a look at that diagram while I explain the next slide. And I want you to just take your finger in your notes and guide yourself along like it's a full-on activity here. Guide yourself along with your finger while I explain the notes, because yes, I could absolutely give you this page of notes, but it's a lot of stuff that just is a lot of content. So I want you to follow along on the picture while I read you these notes, because I don't believe there's anything to fill in here. So the superior and the inferior vena cavae bring oxygen poor blood, so low in oxygen, to the right atrium. So make sure you point out those. You should probably have a finger coming from the top and the bottom, and then your finger should be on the right atrium, which is on which side of the diagram? The left side, that's right. I mean, that's correct. Not that's right, it's correct. Blood then flows through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. So make sure you identify the tricuspid valve as well as the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, blood passes through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary artery. So the pulmonary artery is like sort of that pulmonary trunk I mentioned yesterday. It's sort of that, I know you don't have colors there, but it's sort of like just north of smack dab in the middle of the heart. From the pulmonary artery, blood leaves the heart and picks up oxygen in the lungs and returns through the pulmonary veins. So those are those two little side veins that are underneath the arteries. Pulmonary veins empty oxygenated blood. We have now oxygen-rich blood into the left atrium, which now is on the right side of the heart because it's sitting in the person. It's what we call in situ, INSITU. That's sort of describing that the heart is in that person's body. And it's in the left atrium. It then passes or flows through the mitral valve into the left ventricle. And then the left ventricle has the blood flow through the aortic valve. Now that one's sort of tough to see, but you can see it there. It's sort of like a puckered up thing tucked up into the top left of the left ventricle, through the aortic valve and then to the aorta where it can go up. And the aorta carries blood out to the body. So it can go upwards through any of those three valves, or as I said yesterday, it can curve downwards into the descending aorta down to the lower half of the body. Are we good? Good. I think that's always important. I know it's sort of juvenile to actually like trace your finger, but it really does help with the pathway of blood, especially when we dissect hearts, either late next week or early the week after. A little spring break send off for you. All right, so we'll turn the page in your notes. So I've read through these notes that basically were the diagram that was before it. And we'll get through a little description of the heart. So the heart is two pumps and therefore is called a double pump. The right side of the heart is called the pulmonary pump. Now, if you remember from yesterday, anything that has the word pulmonary deals with the, that's right, Ethne, the lungs, deals with the lungs. Anything cardiac deals with the heart, pulmonary deals with the lungs. So the right side of the heart, the right atrium and the right ventricle pumps deoxygenated blood to the pulmonary circuit and then goes to the lungs. And what does it get in the lungs? Finley? That's right, it picks up oxygen in the lungs because you're breathing in. And what is it dropping off in the lungs? Billy? Yeah, CO2, carbon dioxide. So it's picking up oxygen, dropping off carbon dioxide. So that blood is now oxygenated, and it comes back to the left atrium, then the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle pumps that newly oxygenated blood through the aorta, and then it goes all over your body to all of the body systems. And that's why it's called the systemic pump. So that oxygenated blood is pumped out to the general systemic circulation. One thing to keep in mind, as it says in your notes, is that the blood that's oxygenated never mixes with the blood that's deoxygenated. So it's separated by the septum that we talked about yesterday. The septum separates the left and the right side. So if you just remember, the right side of the heart is deoxygenated, it's oxygen poor, and the left side is oxygen rich. So the left ventricle pumps blood under higher pressure. I sort of mentioned this yesterday or alluded to it because I said that the left ventricle is like the meatiest in terms of muscle. It's got a lot of muscle into it. So the wall of the left ventricle, or the left ventricular wall, is more muscular. So the next slide, we're going to talk about what's called the cardiac cycle, which it goes hand in hand with what we're explaining here with the pulmonary and systemic pump. So we'll flip to, or that's at the bottom of your page on your next slide, slide 15. So the events of the heartbeat are called the cardiac cycle. They're highly coordinated so that the two chambers at the top, the atria, contract at the same time. And then the lower two chambers, the ventricles, they then pump at the same time. So when your heart is basically contracting, that's called systole. It's when your heart is squeezing, and it's basically squeezing all the blood out of the heart. And when it's done squeezing and it just rests, it's no longer contracting, it's called diastole. And during diastole is when the heart fills up with blood again. Now, it says there that the normal heart rate at rest is 60 to 80 beats per minute. So we're going to take a second here for you to actually measure that. I will time out 30 seconds, then you'll multiply it by 2 to get your pulse. So you could check your artery right up in here. That's one place up in your neck. Or you could check your brachial artery, which is at your wrist. Those are two of the strongest ones. The other one, we will not recommend that you do because it's basically in your groin, and that's really not appropriate to do in class. So we'll take one of these two, the neck or the wrist. And we'll start counting now. And stop. All right, so I'm just going to ask random people how many they got. Lily? 72. Yeah, take your number and multiply it by 2. Marissa? 75. So that's well within 6. Okay, that's all right. Finley? 74. Isa? Anybody get below 70? Matt, what'd you get? 65. Ethne? 58. You must be a super athlete. As you roll your eyes. Caitlin? 54. Charles? Okay. So typically, if you're like a really good athlete, unless you're like an outlier, your resting heart rate is probably really low. Like Lance Armstrong, famed biker slash blood doper for the Tour de France. I think his resting heart rate was something like in the 20s because his body is just like so well finely tuned that it doesn't need to beat all that well or add that quickly to pump blood through his body. So anyway, hopefully you fall within the 60 to 80 beats per minute. Of course, you could be higher or lower for a variety of reasons. Maybe you can't multiply, or maybe you're really good health, or maybe you have really bad health, or maybe you just came to class running and therefore you have higher than 80 beats per minute. Anything can happen. What you should not do is ask me what the reason is, because I'm not a doctor. I'm merely a high school biology teacher. Okay, moving on. There's something called the lub-dub that are heart sounds produced by turbulence and tissue vibration as your valves, your tricuspid valve, your aortic valve, your pulmonary valve, and your mitral valve, all of those are pushing blood through them, and then the valves open and close. And just like a regular valve, you'll have certain instances where some blood gets through and starts to make a gurgly sound, but hopefully your valves just open and close really, really cleanly is a good word. The lub sound is as your AV valves close, so that's your tricuspid and your mitral valves. And your dub is when the semilunar, so your aortic or your pulmonary valves close. So that's your lub dub. And those literally are technical terms that are used in medicine. It says there at the bottom, sort of tough to see, but you'll need to write it down there. It says other abnormal sounds are referred to as heart murmurs. So for a heart murmur, instead of just going lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, it'll go lub dub, shh, lub dub, shh, lub dub, shh, when you listen to it with a stethoscope, because that shh sound is basically blood squeaking through or getting through the valves that aren't properly closing. So instead of closing like this, and people at home, I'm like closing my hands together like a clap. Instead of going like lub dub, it's going lub dub, shh, lub dub, shh. So it's not properly closing and stuff's getting through. Okay, moving on. We do have a diagram coming up, I believe. Yep. So this is what happens on the left side here. I'll try to draw this out for people at home. There we go. Let's use green. All right. So for this diagram here, what's happening is the atria in the heart are the ones that are squeezing inwards. So that's what's happening there. So that's your lub. And then down here in the second drawing, your ventricles are squeezing. So they're being pushed in on both sides. And that's your dub. And for lastly, this diagram, there's that pause because they're actually filling up with blood now, both in the atria and ventricles. So this is your lub. This is your dub. And this is like the break. Because it doesn't go lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, lub dub. It goes lub dub, break, lub dub, break, lub dub, break. So it's atria contract, then ventricles contract, then they both open up. Pretty straightforward. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Okay, I'm going to clear those, and then we can move on. Okay, on the next slide, this is where we're going to talk about what controls the heart to make it beat. Because you may know about this already, or maybe you don't. Like maybe you only think that the heart only beats because the brain sends its signals. That's not actually true. because the heart will beat on its own. So yeah, it's got this thing called autorhythmicity, which is autorhythmicity, a 6-syllable word that describes that your heart doesn't need stimulation from the brain or signals sent from the brain in order to beat. It's got its own intrinsic conduction system. And like Ed said, it's called autorhythmicity. That says that unlike skeletal muscle or muscles that your bones are attached to, cardiac muscle in the heart, can contract and squeeze without neural stimulation, without the brain telling it to do something. Oh, you guys have that in your notes? Okay. Oh, no, you don't. Okay, you filled that in already. So the autonomic nervous system is something we'll learn about later on in this semester, has inputs to the heart and regulates the rate. So it can speed up or slow down your heartbeat. So it can speed it up to like 90 beats per minute, 120 beats per minute, or it can slow it down to like 50 if it needs to. That's run by a branch of the nervous system called the autonomic nervous system. Now there are two areas of the heart that stimulate it to beat, that has that nodal tissue that it basically has that electrical potential to stimulate your heart to contract and beat. So nodal tissue has both muscular, so it's a muscle, but it's also got nervous characteristics. So it can send out electrical signals to the other parts of the heart. So what it means is it can generate action potentials, and that's not a term that I think that you're familiar with. So basically what an action potential is it's an electrical signal. So that's an action potential. And again, we will learn about action potentials in the nervous system later on, maybe in March. Nope, sorry, May, because it is March. And the two areas in the heart that are in the heart that create these electrical signals are the SA node and the AV node. Now the question you have is, Isa? That's right. What do SA and AV stand for? It's a good question. So SA stands for sinoatrial. And AV node, anybody know what AV stands for? We saw AV in yesterday's class for the valves that exist between the atria and the ventricles. So AV stands for atrioventricular. So SA node and AV node. So again, these are the nodal tissue areas, the parts of the heart that are muscles, but they can actually generate electricity, so they can force your heart to beat on its own. And as I had mentioned earlier, you can be in the hospital and your brain's not functioning, and they call that a vegetative state. So your brain's not actually functioning properly, but your heart is still pumping. And that's just one of the most amazing things about the heart, that it can beat on its own without messages from the brain. Okay, we'll clear these as long as everybody's copied those down. Okay. And we'll move on. So we're going to go more in depth into the intrinsic control of the heart and how the heart beats on its own. So there's the normal conduction pathway that has the SA node that's known as the pacemaker of the heart. You may know of something already called an artificial pacemaker that will stimulate. It's something that gets basically installed near the clavicle or the collarbone, and it just sends electrical signals down to the heart just to make it beat at a regular pace. For those of you who live on a farm or know people who own a farm and they maybe have an electric fence, one thing that you have to keep in mind is that, or that you may know, is that if you ever touch an electric fence, not that I'm saying you should touch it with the back of your hand as opposed to the inside of your hand, because the electricity will cause your muscles to contract. So if you touch the electric fence with the back of your hand, it'll cause your hand to squeeze, and that's fine. You can remove your hand because it's not clamping down on it. But if you grab with the inside of your hand, it's going to clamp down on the electrical fence, and then you won't be able to remove your hand because it's, the muscles are contracting. So that's why it relates to here, where the SA node is the pacemaker, because it actually is the thing that sends out electrical signals to the rest of the heart. Those electrical signals are called action potentials. And the action potential then spreads throughout the atrial muscles. So both atria, the left and right sides of the heart. If you want to write that down, you can as well. Both the left and right sides of the heart. And again, those are just the atria. The SA node sends out those action potentials that go across the atria, and then it also goes downwards to the lower portion of the right atrium to the AV node, atrioventricular node. The AV node then slows down that electrical impulse slightly, and then sends it to something called the AV bundle, which then sends an impulse down the interventricular septum. That's just another word for the septum that occurs between the ventricles. It then branches into many small Purkinje fibers that distribute impulse throughout the ventricle. Some of my highlights are a bit off just because I've exported this to PowerPoint from an Apple Keynote file. But Purkinje fibers. Purkinje is named after a Swedish scientist with the last name Purkinje, but his name is not pronounced Purkinje. I had a Swedish roommate in Montreal, and he's like, it's not Purkinje, it's Purkinje. And I was like, whoa, Purkinje is harder to say than Purkinje. So you guys should know that it's called Purkinje, or know that it's pronounced Purkinje, but you can just say Purkinje. And on the next slide, I'll show you what this looks like. Once you finish writing down Purkinje. All right, moving on. Oh, there's a note there that there's a line at the bottom of your page. It says first the atria contract, and then it's followed by the ventricles. So it says atria contract first, followed by the ventricles. So what does that look like here? So again, for those of you, I just switched the screen, but it said atria contract first, followed by ventricles. So I'm just gonna get my pen up here and so I can mark this up. So your SA node is right here. It's found right in the very top left portion, that yellow spot there of the right atrium. It'll generate electrical impulses or electrical signals or action potentials, whatever we call them. And those electrical signals will travel all the way across from the right side to the left side of the heart, but only in the atria. when they reach this part right here, oh, that's kind of hard to see there. Oh no, you guys can see that here in class. That's the AV node, your atrioventricular node. It's in the lower portion, the lower left portion of the right atrium. And then it then takes that electrical signal and transmits it this way, down the middle, where it hits the AV bundle. The AV bundle is not listed here, but it basically is just right in this area. The AV bundle. The AV bundle will then slow everything down and separate the signal into left and right sides. So it goes downwards toward the, if you remember, this is called the apex of the heart. Goes down towards the apex and then starts curling upwards along the walls of the ventricles. And those are called Purkinje fibers. And remember, anywhere that this green line touches, that's where the heart's going to get electrical signals transmitting, and then it's going to squeeze the muscle. So first thing we have first is, let's do this here. First thing that happens is you have the atria contract first, and then the signal goes down to the ventricles, and then the ventricles contract. Now, if you go back 1, 2, 3 slides to the stages in the cardiac cycle, I'm going to clear these. If you go back 3 slides to stages of the cardiac cycle, to this, the stages of the cardiac cycle go hand in hand with the intrinsic control of the heart. So we have the atria contract first, then the ventricles, and then it rests. So we can get back to this. And that's the stages of the cardiac cycle that I drew earlier. So that's how the heart itself makes electrical signals so that it beats lub-dub, 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 top, bottom, top, bottom, top, bottom. So it's sort of all sort of plays a part together. We're now going to get to what's called the extrinsic control of the heart, and then we will get back to this diagram on the right, which is called the EKG. So we've talked about intrinsic control of the heart, and that can absolutely be like a 6-mark question, folks. Intrinsic control of the heart. So the slide that was before your last diagram, where it said normal conduction pathway at the top, that'd probably be a good slide to put a star beside, and then circle that star, and then highlight that circle star. So again, that would probably be slide number, oh, there aren't numbers anymore. It says normal conduction pathway at the very top point. Now we're talking about, instead of the heart controlling its beat, we're going to talk about the heart being controlled by something external or extrinsically. So the cardiac control center in a part of the brain called the medulla, and we've talked about that in the wellness and homeostasis unit, has inputs to the heart through what's called the autonomic nervous system. The word autonomic sounds a whole lot like what word? Automatic, that's right. And that's good because you can sort of relate that. The autonomic nervous system deals with things that are done automatically, like breathing. You don't have to think to breathe in and breathe out. I mean, you can, but you don't have to think 24 hours a day, every single minute of the day, every single second to breathe in and then breathe out. It happens automatically. Digestion happens automatically. You don't have to think, okay, stomach, break down my sandwich that I just ate. It just happens, and that's part of the autonomic nervous system. You also don't have to think to make your heart beat. And that's what we're getting to here, is that the autonomic nervous system sends signals to control your heart rate as opposed to making it beat. So while the heart can actually make itself beat, the medulla in the brain can control the rate. So the first thing is parasympathetic stimulation, which causes a decrease in your heart rate. That's another 6-syllable word, parasympathetic. And that sounds a lot like the next word, which is sympathetic stimulation. Now they're the exact same word, except sympathetic has para at the as a prefix. And a good way to remember that is parasympathetic, because it has more letters, will take longer to say, so it slows down your heart rate, while sympathetic has fewer letters, so then it increases your heart rate. So a way to remember that. So there's 2 points to make note of. If I ask you, how is the heartbeat controlled extrinsically? Well, it's through the medulla in the brain that has 2 types of stimulation, parasympathetic and sympathetic stimulation, that decreases the heart rate for parasympathetic and can increase the heart rate through sympathetic stimulation. Not only that, your heart rate can also be controlled by hormones. So there are things like epinephrine and norepinephrine, which speed up your heart rate, kind of like versions of adrenaline, but make sure you use the terms epinephrine and norepinephrine. And that occurs sometimes during exercise or during a fight or flight response. If you get really scared, you're either going to start fighting or you're going to run off really, really quickly. So fight or flight response. We got 2 more slides before the 5-point quiz. And that's dealing with the electrocardiogram, which has the diagram at the bottom of your page. So the EKG, electrocardiogram, it's with a K, because in England they sometimes use electrocardiogram with a K, even though it's cardio with a C here in North America. So it's either an ECG or an EKG. Is something that records the electrical activity of the heart. The information that you can gather from the electrical or the readout from this electrocardiogram can give you information on heart rate, how fast your heart is beating, the rhythm, and it can also give information on whether that electrical activity or the pathway is working properly. So there are certain parts of it. There's the P wave that deals with atrial depolarization, which is just another word for your atria are contracting. Oops. So P wave is where your atria contract. Your QRS complex, which is where it says ventricular depolarization, but that's just a fancy way of saying ventricles contract. And then lastly, you have the T wave, which is ventricular repolarization. Which basically means that your atria and your ventricles relax. And today's notes are really great because everything sort of relates to one whole concept. And that is that with the P wave, This is basically your lub, your QRS complex, this is your dub, and your T wave is the break. So again, we're getting back to lubbed up, break, lubbed up, break, lubbed up, break. Part of the cardiac cycle. Which takes us down to the bottom of the next diagram to end off your notes for today and lead us into our 5-point quiz. Just going to clear this. Is everybody good? Okay, so we have the conduction system of the heart. We've seen this diagram before. We talked about how gonna make this a bit bigger here. We talked about how the SA node creates an action potential, sends it across to the atria from the right to the left, hits the AV node, brings it down to the AV bundle right here, brings it down the interventricular septum and up to the Purkinje fibers, which one after the other creates or causes the atria to contract and then the ventricles to contract. Your lub, then your dub, then your relaxation. Now that starts to have an important point here on the right side for these diagrams. This is your EKG. This is your readout. So here's your P wave. And that P wave is, I'm going to erase some stuff here so I can color code things. Your P wave is your atria contracting. So the top portion of your heart. Your QRS complex, which is this, I'm trying to trace this as best as I can. That is your ventricles contracting. So with the help of the Purkinje fibers, that's what's happening there. And then your T wave, lastly, let's go with red. It's right there. That's where everything sort of shuts off and relaxes. That's your break or your rest. Your lub, that's your dub, and this is your break. So what you can actually figure out from here is that if something is wrong with your EKG, you can kind of allude to the fact that something's wrong with your heart. So instead of looking like this, if it looked like, let's say here's your P wave, and then instead of your QRS wave, it looks like this, and then there's your T wave. I'll mark those down. So here's your P, and if you didn't already notice, it's in alphabetical order, P, Q, R, S, T. So if you know that something's wrong here with your QRX complex, right there, because it looks like that, but it should have a high spike, you can already think about, okay, what does the QRS complex deal with? It deals with your ventricles contracting. So then you can say, okay, something's probably wrong with the ventricles closing, or maybe the aortic valve or your pulmonary valve, something wrong there because they're not closing properly. So it's possible. You can identify there. It seems like everything's a-okay here with your P wave, looks good. Your T wave looks good, but it's that QRS complex that it looks a little off. Now, again, if you did something else where it was, I'll draw it again down here. If you had another one that went like this, and then your P, QRS, and then T, and you have P, Q, R, S, T, there's something wrong with what part of that? What looks abnormal there? Isa? The T looks abnormal? Okay, maybe. I was really trying to make sure that the P looked very flat as opposed to this one, which has a little bit of a bump. So if the P wave is flat, then that means something's wrong with the atria contracting, because that's atrial depolarization from your last slide. So you can sort of identify what area of the heart is malfunctioning? Any questions about that? There's a good chance I'll ask you a question about that on the test as well. I know you just wrote a test, but I'm just giving you a heads up. So maybe you want to put a star beside that. And then maybe you want to circle that star. And then maybe you want to highlight that circled star. Any questions from people here in house? Okay, we're going to stop there. We're going to do our 5-point quiz. People at home, you are more than welcome to stick around and watch the 5-point quiz and maybe do it as a review for today's notes. Or you can leave. I'm going to stop recording now.